I drove nights in Detroit for 12 years. 12 years is long enough that the city stops being a map and starts being a body you know the bones of. You learn which lights stay yellow too long on Cass. You learn the dip on Mac near Burns, where a low car will scrape if you take it past 30. You learn that the airport runs are gold between 4 and 6 in the morning, and that nobody tips on Woodward after the bars close, and that the kind of fare who calls you sir twice in the first sentence is usually about to ask you to do something you shouldn't. I'm telling you this because what happened on the night I want to talk about happened to a man who already knew his job. It didn't happen to a beginner. I'd seen drunks. I'd seen fights in the back seat. I'd had a guy die of an overdose between my back doors one February with the meter still running, and I'd kept my head and called it in and waited for the paramedics in the cold without crying or panicking or any of the things you think you'd do. I'm not a man who is easy to spook. I want that on the record before I tell you the rest, because the rest is going to sound like I am, and I'm not. This was a Friday in late October. I remember the date roughly because the Tigers had finished their season already, and my daughter had texted me earlier that week about Thanksgiving, asking if I was going to come out to Lansing, or if she should come down. I hadn't answered her yet. That's going to matter later, but not in the way you think. I started the shift at 9. I was driving my own car back then, a 2014 Chevy Impala with about 180,000 on it. Decent shocks, an aux cord that worked when it felt like it, and a small chip in the windshield on the passenger side that caught streetlights at a certain angle and turned them into little stars. I mentioned the chip because I looked at it a lot that night, more than usual. The first 3 hours were nothing. A couple from a wine bar in Midtown going home to Lafayette Park. 2 guys from a Tigers-related work dinner who tipped well and argued about a contractor the whole ride. A woman who needed to get from her job at one of the hospitals back to her car, which he'd left at a friend's house in West Village. Normal. The kind of fares that pay your rent and don't stay in your memory. The first time I picked her up was at 10:47. I remember the exact time because I had just looked at the dashboard clock and done the math on how much longer until midnight, when the surge prices usually kick up. The ping came in from a stop on Selden, just east of 2nd near one of those bars that used to be a garage. The name on the app was Danny, just Danny. No last initial, which is fine. Plenty of people don't bother filling that part in. I pulled up and a woman came out of the doorway alone. Mid-30s, maybe a little older, hard to tell at night. Dark coat, knee-length, buttoned, hair pulled back. She had one of those bags that looks like it's been to work and back too many times. The leather softened past its original shape. She got in the back on the passenger side, which is what most women do at night, and she said good evening before I did, which most people don't. Going to the address on the app? I asked. Yes, please. The address was an apartment building off East Jefferson, near the bridge to Belle Isle, about 15 minutes if the lights cooperated. I pulled out and we drove. She didn't talk, and I didn't push. I'm not one of those drivers who fills the air. If a passenger wants to talk, I'm easy. If they don't, I'm easier. She looked out the window the whole way. I could see her in the rear view at the lights, just the angle of her cheek and the line of her jaw, the soft motion of her head as she tracked something outside. About halfway through the ride, she said, "You've been driving a long time." I said, 12 years. She said, "You can tell the way you take the corners." I laughed a little. Most people don't notice. "My father was a driver," she said. "Different city, but you can tell." That was the whole conversation. She got out at her building, said, "Thank you," said, "Have a good night," and tipped $4 on a $14 fare, which is on the higher end of normal, but not memorable. The app showed 5 stars from her about 90 seconds after she got out. I sat at the curb for a minute, made a note on my phone about a side street I was thinking about cutting through, and then I took the next ping. I want to be clear that nothing about that ride was strange, not a single thing. If she had only ridden with me once that night, I would not remember her face at all. I want you to understand that, because what I'm about to tell you is going to sit on top of that ordinary first ride, like a hand pressing down on a piece of paper. And the only reason it presses down at all is because the paper was so flat to begin with. The second time was at 1:14 in the morning. I had done 6 more rides by then, including one stretch out to Dearborn that I almost turned down because it took me out of the surge zone. I was on my way back in, empty, on I-94, when the ping came in for a pickup on Sheen, north of Gratiot. Name on the app, Renee. Shine at 1 in the morning is not Selden at 10:45. The bar I picked her up from the first time had soft yellow lights spilling out onto the sidewalk, and people standing under it smoking. Shane at 1 is dark. There's a stretch where the streetlights are out for 3 or 4 blocks at a time, and a lot of the buildings on either side are either boarded or gone entirely, just the foundations left, weeds growing up through them. You don't get a lot of pickups there. When you do, it's usually somebody coming off a late shift somewhere, walking home from work, needing a ride the last mile because the buses have stopped. I pulled up to the pin. There was nobody on the sidewalk. I waited the usual 2 minutes. I was about to tap the no-show button when a woman came around the corner of the nearest building, walking calm, no hurry, like she'd known exactly when I was going to be there. She got in the back, passenger side. Dark coat, knee length, buttoned, hair pulled back, same bag. I looked at her in the rear view, and she looked back at me, and there was a full second where I forgot the question I was supposed to ask. "Renee?" I said finally. "Yes." "Going to the address on the app?" "Yes, please." The address was a house off McNichols, way up on the north end, almost to Highland Park. Another 15, 20 minutes depending on lights. I pulled out. My hands were on the wheel, the way they always are. I drove the way I always do. But my eyes kept going to the mirror. It was her. It was the same woman, the same coat, the same hair, the same bag, the same small mole high on her left cheekbone that I had not consciously registered the first time, but that I recognized now because seeing it again was what made me sure. Her face had the same tiredness it had at 10:47, not sleepy tired, the other kind, the kind that has nothing to do with the hour. I told myself the obvious things. Maybe she had gone home, changed her mind, gone back out, gotten dropped somewhere else, was now heading to a different place. Maybe the first address hadn't been her apartment. Maybe it had been a friend's. Maybe she lived a complicated life. None of that is forbidden. None of that is impossible. People do strange things at night in big cities. I have driven women between 3 apartments in one night because they were fighting with 2 different partners. I have driven a man from his house to his ex-wife's house, to a hotel, to his own house again, all in 4 hours. People are allowed to move, but the names, Danny at 10:47, Renee at 1:14, same phone, presumably, same face, definitely, different account, definitely, or the app would have linked them. I said, "Because I am a person who would rather know than not know. Have I picked you up before?" She was looking out the window. She didn't turn her head. She said, "Earlier tonight." I waited for her to add something. She didn't. I said, "2 different names." She said, "Yes." She said it the way you'd say yes to someone asking if it was raining, like the fact was a fact, and there was no further commentary required about it. I drove for another minute without saying anything. We were on Gratiot heading northeast, the long diagonal that cuts through the east side, and the lights were going my way, which I noticed because I had nothing else to focus on. I said, "Can I ask why?" She said, "It's easier with 2. I waited. She didn't say, "Easier than what?" I said, "Are you in trouble?" She turned her head then, finally, and looked at me in the mirror. Not the back of my head, the mirror itself, my eyes in the mirror. And she said, "No, you're not. I'm not either. We're fine." That's exactly what she said. "You're not. I'm not either. We're fine." The order of those sentences is the part that stayed with me. The thing she said first was about me. I dropped her off at the McNichols address. It was a small house, 2 stories, a porch light on, no other lights in the windows. She said thank you, said, "Have a good night," and tipped $4 on a $19 fare. The app showed 5 stars about 90 seconds later. I sat at the curb with the engine running for a long time. The porch light at her house clicked off while I was sitting there, even though she had only been inside for about 2 minutes. I don't know what that means. It might mean nothing. It might mean she has a motion sensor light, and she walked back into a part of the house where it couldn't see her. I am telling you what I saw. I took my hands off the wheel and put them on my knees, and I sat there, and I tried to think. Here's what I knew. A woman had ridden in my car twice in 3 hours under 2 different names. She had acknowledged it openly when I asked. She had told me, unprompted, that I was not in trouble. People do not tell you that you are not in trouble unless there exists some scenario in which a person might think they are. Here is what I did not know. Whether there would be a third ride, whether I wanted there to be, whether I had any choice about it. I'm going to tell you the thing I didn't tell the police later when I told them most of the rest. The thing I did was, I closed the app. I tapped the little toggle that takes you off duty. I sat there in the dark on McNichols for about 10 minutes with the app closed and the meter off and just breathed. And then I turned the app back on. I want you to understand why, because it's going to sound stupid. And it isn't. It is the truest thing in this whole story. I turned the app back on because I had the strong, clear sense that whether the app was on or off was not going to change what happened next. And if it was going to happen anyway, I would rather be working when it did. I would rather have the structure of the job around me. I would rather be the driver. That was the version of myself I trusted most that night, and I wanted to stay inside him. I drove for almost 2 hours after that without seeing her. 3 normal rides. A drunk kid from a house party who fell asleep before I got him home, and whose roommate had to come down to the curb to help me get him out of the car. A nurse coming off a shift at Henry Ford who talked the whole way about her mother's diabetes. A guy who didn't say a word the entire ride and tipped 20%. By 3 in the morning, I had almost talked myself into the idea that there were going to be 2 rides, not 3. I had built a story in my head where she lived a complicated life, had needed a ride from 2 different places, had used 2 different accounts for 2 different sides of that life, and that was all of it. I had even started feeling a little embarrassed about how my hands had felt on the wheel earlier. I am a grown man. I have seen things. A woman taking 2 rides under 2 names was not, by itself, a horror story. It was a Tuesday. The 3rd ping came in at 3:41. The pickup was on West Verner near Junction, deep in Southwest, down by the rail yards. The name on the app was Mary. I sat at the light I was stopped at, and I looked at the name, and I felt my stomach do the slow tilt it does when you already know. I could have declined the ride. Drivers decline rides. There would have been no consequence beyond a small ding on my acceptance rate. I could have closed the app again and driven home. I had made enough money for the night. I want you to know that I considered it. I sat at the light through 1 full cycle without moving, and a car behind me honked, and I waved an apology and pulled forward, and I tapped accept. I tapped accept because I thought, if it's her, I want to know what she wants. I thought, if it's not her, I want to be wrong, and I want to know I was wrong, and I want to go home knowing that. I thought, 3 is not a number that goes away, because you avoid it. 3 is a number that finds you on a different night if you don't let it find you on this one. I don't know where I got that idea. It was just there, sitting in my chest like something I had always known. The drive to the pickup took 11 minutes. I went down Michigan Avenue past the abandoned train station, which had been getting fixed up that year but was still mostly dark at that hour, and then south on Junction. The streets down there are quiet at 4 in the morning in a way that no other part of the city quite is. There are trucks coming and going from the rail yards even then, but they're on their own routes, and on the residential streets in between, you can drive for 10 minutes without seeing another car. The pin was in front of a small white house with a chain-link fence around it. The porch was dark. There was a wind chime hanging from the eave that wasn't moving because there wasn't any wind. She was already standing on the sidewalk when I pulled up. Same coat, same hair, same bag. She got in the back, passenger side. She closed the door more softly than the first 2 times. "Mary?" I said. Yes. Going to the address on the app? She didn't say yes. She said, it's a long ride. Is that all right? I looked at the app. The destination was an address out past River Rouge, almost to the edge of a course, on a stretch of road that runs near the river and isn't a place most people are trying to go at 4 in the morning. The estimated time was 26 minutes. That's fine, I said. I pulled out and I drove, and for the first 10 minutes neither of us spoke. I will tell you that I noticed, as I drove, that I had stopped looking at her in the mirror. I had been looking at her constantly in the first 2 rides. In this one, I kept my eyes on the road. I think it was because I had understood, somewhere in the time between accepting the ride and her getting in the car, that looking at her was not going to give me any more information than I already had. The information I needed wasn't in her face. It was in why she had picked me 3 times. She spoke first. She said, "You haven't asked me my real name." I said, "I figured if you wanted me to know it, you'd have used it the first time." She said, "That's kind of you." I said, "I'm not being kind. I'm being tired." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Those aren't different things." I almost laughed at that. I didn't, but I almost did. It was the first thing she had said all night that sounded like a person talking, instead of like someone reading lines off a card she had already practiced. I said, "Are you going to tell me what tonight is?" She said, "If you want." I said, "I want." She turned her head toward the window. We were on Fort Street by then, going southwest, past the Marathon refinery, the towers lit up orange and white, the way they always are, the flares burning low and steady on the tops of them. It always looks like another planet down there at night. It always has. She said, "I'm not anything you need to be scared of. I want to say that first. I picked you because of the way you drove the first one. Most drivers, when I get in their car, I can tell within the first block whether they are paying attention to me as a person or as a fare. You drove me like a person. You didn't say anything you didn't mean. You took the corner on Larned without bracing because you knew the road. I needed someone who knew the road." I said, "Knew the road for what?" She said, "For the 3rd ride." I waited. She said, "There are nights when I have to be in 3 places. The first 2 places I can get to by myself, but they take something out of me, and by the 3rd one, I'm not in good enough shape to do it alone. I needed a driver who would be steady at 4 in the morning, so I rode with you twice early to find out if you would be." I said, "And if I hadn't been?" She said, "I'd have ridden with someone else for the 3rd one." I said, "What's the 3rd one?" She was quiet for a while. We passed the refinery. We passed the long stretch where the road runs between the rail yards on the left and the river on the right, and the only lights are the truck lights from the freight crossing. She said, "My sister lives at the address on the app. She is not well. She has not been well for a long time. The way she is not well makes it dangerous to visit her at certain times and necessary to visit her at others. Tonight is one of the necessary ones. I make the trip every 6 weeks. Usually I take a cab from a real cab company, but the driver I used to use retired in the spring, and since then I have been looking for someone steady. I think it's you, if you'll have it." I drove for another half mile before I answered. I said, "You used 2 different names tonight." She said, "I have 2 accounts because the first one got flagged once for too many late-night rides to the same address, and the support people called me to ask if I was being trafficked. I didn't want to explain my sister to a stranger on the phone, so I made a second account. The 3rd name is the one I actually use. It's not Mary. I just didn't want to give it to you on the app until I knew." I said, "Until you knew what?" She said, "Whether you'd take the 3rd ride." We turned off Fort onto a smaller road that ran along the river. The address was a brick duplex with a single light on in the upstairs window. I pulled up to the curb and put the car in park, and for a moment neither of us moved. She said, "I'll be inside for about 40 minutes. Will you wait?" I said, "Yes." She said, "My name is Anna." She got out of the car and walked up to the door of the duplex and let herself in with a key. The light in the upstairs window went off about 30 seconds after she went inside, and a different light, downstairs, went on. I sat in the car with the engine running because it was cold, and I watched the downstairs light, and I thought about my daughter's text from earlier in the week. I want to tell you something here that I have not said out loud before. The reason I had not answered my daughter's text was not because I was busy. It was because every time I tried to answer it, I felt a kind of low panic that I did not have a name for. The panic was about going to Lansing and sitting at a table with her and her husband and her 2 kids and being seen by them for 4 days as the version of me that I have become, which is a man who drives at night and lives in a 1-bedroom apartment off 8 Mile and has not called his daughter on the phone, not texted, called in almost a year. I had been avoiding the answer because the answer required me to either lie about who I was now or admit it. And admitting it to her, in her house, in front of her kids, felt like more than I could carry. I am telling you this because while I sat outside that duplex on the edge of the city at 4:30 in the morning, waiting for a woman I had picked up 3 times under 3 different names to come out of her sister's apartment, I was thinking about that text. I was thinking about it because something Anna had said earlier in the ride had lodged itself in me, and I couldn't get it out. She had said, "I'm not being kind, I'm being tired." Those aren't different things. And I had understood, sitting there in the dark, that I had been telling myself for a year that I wasn't calling my daughter because I was tired, and that meant something different than not calling her because I was scared, and that Anna was right, and they were not different things. They had never been different things, and I was the only person I had been lying to about it. She came back out at 5:14. She got in the back seat and closed the door softly, the way she had this time, and she said, "Thank you for waiting." I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I will be in a couple of hours. I always am." I said, "Where to?" She gave me an address back in Midtown, not far from where I had picked her up the first time. The ride back took 35 minutes because the morning shift traffic was starting to thicken up by then. We did not talk much. She closed her eyes for most of it. I watched the road. I did not look at her in the mirror, except once, when I came to a stop at the light at Trumbull and Forest, and I caught a glimpse of her face, and her eyes were open, and she was looking at the chip in my windshield, the one on the passenger side that catches the streetlights, and she was smiling a little, not at me, at the chip, like it was an old friend. I dropped her off at her real address. She tipped $20 on a $41 fare. She said, "6 weeks, I'll request you by name. The name on the app will be Mary. That way you'll know it's me." I said, "All right." She said, "Get some sleep." She got out and she went inside, and I sat at the curb for another minute, and then I drove home. I want to tell you what I did the next morning, because it is the only thing in this whole story that I would call an ending. I got home at about 6, I showered, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I looked at my phone and I opened the text from my daughter that I had been ignoring for 4 days, and I called her. It was 7 in the morning on a Saturday, and I knew she would be up because she has 2 small kids, and nobody with 2 small kids sleeps past 6 on a Saturday. She picked up on the second ring. She said, "Dad, is everything okay?" I said, Yeah, everything's okay. I'm sorry I haven't called." There was a pause on the other end. Then she said, "It's okay." I said, "It isn't. I'm going to come for Thanksgiving. I want to come." She said, "Okay, Dad." She said it the way Anna had said yes in the back of my car, like a fact, like a thing that did not require further commentary. I want to be careful here, because I know what this is going to sound like to some of you. It is going to sound like I am telling you that a ghost picked me 3 times in one night to teach me a lesson about calling my daughter. I am not telling you that. I do not think Anna was a ghost. I think Anna was a woman with a sister and a complicated life and 2 accounts on a rideshare app. And I think she picked me because I drove the corner on Larned without bracing. I think the rest of it was me. I think the rest of it was what I did with the time between the second ride and the third ride, and what I did with the 40 minutes outside the duplex while I waited for. I think she did not teach me anything. I think she gave me 3 hours of being looked at by somebody who was paying attention, and 3 hours of being looked at by somebody who was paying attention is enough sometimes, to make a person hear the things he has been telling himself. I drove for her every 6 weeks for another 4 years. She always used the name Mary on the app. The fare was always the same address on Verner for the pickup, the same duplex by the river for the long stop, and her real apartment in Midtown for the drop. She never told me her sister's name, and I never asked. The night her sister died, she texted me directly, not through the app, and asked me to drive her to the duplex one last time. I did. I waited 4 hours that night. When she came out, she got in the front seat instead of the back, and she did not say anything the whole way home. I dropped her off, and she said thank you, and she got out. And that was the last time I drove her. I retired 8 months later. My back was done by then, and so was the Impala. I think about her sometimes, not in a haunted way, in the way you think about anyone who saw you at a particular moment and let you see them back. I think about the chip in my windshield, which is still there because I still have the Impala, even though I don't drive it for work anymore. I think about the small smile she gave it at the light at Trumbull and Forest, like she had been keeping track of it the whole night, the same way I had been keeping track of her. People ask me sometimes, when they find out I drove nights in Detroit for 12 years, what the scariest thing I ever saw was. I usually tell them the overdose story, because it's the one that sounds like the answer they want. The truth is, the scariest thing I ever saw was a woman who got in my back seat 3 times in one night and didn't do anything to me except be patient with me while I figured out what she was for. The truth is, the scariest thing about that night was not her. It was how close I had come, before she got in my car, to becoming a man who would never have called his daughter back. That's the one I think about. That's the one that stayed. I had another night about a year later that I don't talk about as much. It was a man this time, not a woman. And he only got in the car once, and he didn't ask me to wait anywhere. But he was reading a book in the back seat. And when I looked at the cover in the mirror, it was a book I had thrown away 19 years earlier, and I had never told anyone I had owned it. And the copy he was holding had my handwriting on the inside of the front cover. But that's a different story, and I'll tell it another time.